The courtyard was slick with rain and blood. 300 hardened wolves of the Obsidian Crest Pack held their breath as Ravage, the Alpha King's towering, undefeated war beast, snapped its iron chains. It didn't lunge for the bleeding traitors in the pit. Instead, the 9-foot monster turned its glowing amber eyes towards the crowd, stalking toward a terrified, shivering waitress holding a stack of dirty plates. King Blaze drew his silver blade, preparing to put his own legendary beast down to save her. But before the blade could fall, the monster dropped to its knees, pressing its heavily scarred snout into the muddy sneakers of the poorest girl in Oakhaven. The entire pack fell dead silent. The rain in Oakhaven never really stopped. It just paused to let the fog roll in. Harper Bennett wiped down the cracked laminate counter of Pete's Diner for the 4th time that hour, her hands smelling permanently of cheap bleach and stale coffee. At 21, Harper's life was a predictable cycle of double shifts, unpaid bills, and dodging the debt collectors her father had left behind when he skipped town. Oakhaven wasn't just a forgotten logging town. It was a borderland. It sat right on the edge of the Blackwood territory, home to the Obsidian Crest Pack. Most humans in town pretended the wolves didn't exist, wrapping themselves in a blanket of willful ignorance. But Harper knew the truth. She saw them when they came into the diner, men and women who moved too gracefully, their eyes catching the neon signs with a predatory, reflective flash. Her father, Arthur Bennett, hadn't just owed money to local loan sharks. He had borrowed from the pack's human fronts to fund his gambling addiction. And in the werewolf world, debt wasn't settled with bankruptcy. It was settled with blood. The diner bell chimed, cutting through the low hum of the rain. The temperature in the room seemed to plummet instantly. 3 men walked in, and the few late-night truckers sitting in the booths suddenly found their stale pie incredibly fascinating. The man leading them was Gideon, the beta of the Obsidian Crest. He wore a tailored charcoal suit that looked absurdly out of place in the greasy spoon, but the way his broad shoulders filled the doorway made it clear he didn't care. "Harper Bennett," Gideon said. His voice was a low rumble that vibrated against the coffee mugs on the shelf. Harper's grip on her rag tightened until her knuckles turned white. "I don't have the money yet. Payday is Friday. I told Mr. Higgins." "Mr. Higgins no longer holds your father's debt," Gideon interrupted, stepping up to the counter. He didn't look at her with malice, but rather the cold, clinical detachment of a butcher appraising a cut of meat. "Alpha King Blaze has consolidated all territorial debts. Your father owes $50,000. Seeing as Arthur has vanished, the debt falls to his next of kin." "50,000? Harper's breath caught in her throat. The diner spun slightly. "I make $9 an hour. I can't pay that." "We know," Gideon replied smoothly, "which is why you are coming with us. The Alpha King has use for human labor at the estate. You will work off your family's debt. Get your coat." Panic flared in Harper's chest. Stories about the Obsidian Crest estate were whispered in hushed, terrified tones. Humans who went up the mountain didn't come back down. Not the same, anyway. They became indentured servants, bound to the terrifying whims of predators. "I can't," she whispered, backing away towards the kitchen swinging doors. "I have a life here. I have rent." Gideon's eyes flashed a brilliant, unnatural gold. The air in the diner grew unbearably heavy, a suffocating pressure that forced Harper to her knees behind the counter. "It wasn't a request, Harper. You belong to the king now." The Obsidian Crest estate was less of a mansion and more of a fortress carved into the side of the mountain. Towering iron gates, stone walls, and patrolling guards with eyes like shattered glass made it clear that this was a place built for war. Harper was thrown into a small, damp servants' quarter and handed a stiff grey uniform. For 3 weeks, her life became a blur of exhausting labor. She scrubbed endless stone corridors, polished silver that burned her bare skin, and kept her eyes glued to the floor. The #1 rule given to human servants was simple: never look a wolf in the eye. It was during her 4th week, that she first saw him, Alpha King Blaise Montgomery. He was standing in the great hall, surrounded by his generals. Blaise was terrifyingly beautiful, with sharp aristocratic features, jet-black hair, and eyes the color of a stormy sea. But it wasn't his looks that paralyzed Harper. It was the sheer, overwhelming aura of power that bled from him. When he spoke, the room didn't just listen. It submitted. Beside Blaise stood Lila, a high-ranking female wolf who practically draped herself over his arm. Lila despised the human servants, and she had taken a particular disliking to Harper, deliberately knocking over buckets of dirty water just to watch Harper scrub the floors again. "The border skirmishes are escalating, Blaise," Lila was saying, her voice a purr that sent shivers down Harper's spine. "We need to send a message. Unleash Ravage." At the name Ravage, a collective shudder went through the generals. Harper, wiping down the baseboards near the doorway, paused. "Ravage is a weapon of last resort," Blaise replied, his voice a baritone that commanded absolute silence. "He is unstable. If I let him out of the pit, there is no guarantee he will stop at the border." Ravage was the pack's darkest secret, a mutated, overgrown, dire wolf beast that Blaise had rescued and bound to his will years ago. It was said the beast was the size of a grizzly bear, driven mad by years of torture before Blaise claimed him. Ravage answered only to the Alpha King, and even then, barely. He was kept in a reinforced subterranean pit, fed raw meat and the occasional traitor. "Let the beast feed on the prisoners tomorrow at the pack gathering," Lila suggested cruelly, noticing Harper trembling by the door. "Give the pack a show of your strength." Blaise's cold gaze shifted, landing briefly on Harper. For a second, time stopped. His eyes narrowed slightly, a flicker of confusion crossing his stoic face as he caught her scent. Harper quickly bowed her head, her heart hammering against her ribs, terrified she had drawn his wrath. "Fine," Blaise muttered, looking away. "Tomorrow, in the main courtyard. Prepare the beast." The next evening, the sky over the estate was bruised, purple and black, pouring cold rain over the stone courtyard. 300 members of the Obsidian Crest Pack stood in a massive circle, their faces illuminated by the flickering orange light of iron braziers. Harper was exhausted. She had been ordered to serve drinks to the upper echelon wolves during the gathering. She balanced a heavy silver tray of wine glasses, trying to blend into the shadows near the back of the crowd. In the center of the courtyard, 2 rogue wolves, traitors who had tried to sell pack secrets, were chained to heavy stone pillars. They were sobbing, their bravado completely shattered. Suddenly the ground trembled. A heavy metallic grinding echoed through the rain as the steel doors to the subterranean levels were hoisted open. A chorus of snarls and the clinking of massive iron chains followed. 4 burly enforcers struggled to drag the beast out. When Ravage finally emerged from the dark, Harper gasped, nearly dropping her tray. The beast was a nightmare made of muscle and fur. He stood 9 feet tall at the shoulder, covered in thick, matted black fur and jagged silver scars. Thick iron collars wrapped around his neck, attached to heavy chains. His eyes were burning cauldrons of amber fire, and thick saliva dripped from jaws that could easily snap a man in half. The sheer scent of the monster, blood, ozone, and primal fury, made several lesser wolves in the crowd whimper and take a step back. Blaise stood on a raised balcony overlooking the courtyard, his face unreadable. He raised a hand. "Let him off the chains." The enforcers unhooked the mechanisms and sprinted for the safety of the perimeter. Ravage shook his massive head, a deafening roar ripping from his throat that rattled the stained glass of the manor. He locked his burning eyes on the 2 chained rogues. He dug his massive claws into the cobblestone, preparing to charge. At that exact moment, Lila, standing near the back, purposely shoved her shoulder into Harper. Harper lost her footing on the slick stones. She pitched forward, the heavy silver tray crashing to the ground with a deafening clang that echoed above the rain. Shattered glass and red wine spilled everywhere. Harper landed hard on her hands and knees, right inside the perimeter of the circle. The sudden noise snapped Ravage's attention away from the rogues. The monster whipped its massive head around. His amber eyes locked onto Harper. A low, vibrating growl started in his chest. "Get out of there, human!" someone yelled, but Harper was frozen. Her limbs felt like lead. She looked up at the towering beast, her breath catching in her throat. Ravage ignored the rogues. He turned his massive body and began to stalk slowly toward Harper. Each heavy paw step shook the ground. Up on the balcony, Blaze's stoic facade shattered. "No!" he roared. He vaulted over the stone railing, dropping 20 feet into the courtyard, drawing a gleaming silver broadsword from his back. He knew how fast the beast was. He knew he might not reach her in time. Harper squeezed her eyes shut, bracing for the agony of teeth and claws. She thought of her messy apartment, her unpaid bills, and the sheer unfairness of dying in the mud for a debt she didn't owe. But the bite never came. Instead, a hot, wet breath washed over her face. The growling stopped. Harper slowly opened her eyes. Ravage, the unstoppable war beast, the terror of the Obsidian Crest, had halted mere inches from her face. The beast let out a soft, high-pitched whine that sounded entirely incongruous with its monstrous size. Then, to the absolute shock of everyone present, the beast lowered its massive head. Its front legs buckled. Ravage dropped to his knees in the puddles of rain and spilled wine. He pressed his giant, scarred snout gently against Harper's muddy sneakers, letting out a deep, contented rumble. It was an unmistakable posture of absolute submission. Blaze froze mid-stride, his silver sword still raised, his eyes wide with a shock that mirrored the 300 wolves around him. The undisputed Alpha King's inner beast, a creature that bowed to no one, had just submitted to a human waitress. The entire pack fell dead silent. The courtyard remained frozen, suspended in a suffocating disbelief. The only sounds were the relentless downpour hitting the cobblestones and the heavy, ragged breathing of the 9-foot war beast. Ravage, the nightmare of the Obsidian Crest, kept his scarred snout pressed firmly against Harper's mud-soaked sneakers. Alpha King Blaze Montgomery stood 20 feet away, the rain flattening his jet-black hair against his forehead. His silver broadsword, forged to cut down rogue packs, hung uselessly at his side. His storm-grey eyes darted from the beast to the trembling 21-year-old diner waitress, trying to comprehend the impossible. "Step away from her," Blaze commanded, his voice laced with an alpha's compulsion, a tone that usually forced lesser wolves to their knees. Ravage didn't move. Instead, the beast let out a low, warning rumble that vibrated through the ground. It wasn't directed at the chained rogues. It was directed at Blaze. A collective gasp rippled through the 300 wolves watching from the perimeter. The king's own beast was challenging him to protect a human. "Blaze," Gideon the Beta warned in a hushed tone, stepping carefully to the edge of the balcony. "The beast is highly volatile. If you push him, he might tear the girl apart in the crossfire." Harper couldn't breathe. Her heart hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird. She slowly reached out a trembling hand, her fingers hovering over the thick, coarse black fur of the monster's massive neck. She expected her hand to be bitten off. Instead, as her pale skin made contact, Ravage let out a pathetic, high-pitched whine and leaned into her touch, closing his glowing amber eyes. I didn't do anything," Harper whispered, her voice cracking. "Please, I swear." Blaze sheathed his sword with a sharp metallic clack. He approached slowly, his predatory grace evident in every step. "Gideon, prepare the subterranean vault. We are putting him away." "He won't move, sire," one of the heavily armored enforcers stammered. "The chains won't budge him if he anchors himself." Blaze stopped right in front of Harper. Up close, the Alpha King was overwhelmingly intimidating. He smelled of rain, pine, and overwhelming authority. He looked down at her, his expression a complicated mix of fury, suspicion, and undeniable fascination. "You," Blaze ordered, locking his gaze on Harper. "Tell him to follow you." "Me," Harper squeaked. "I don't know how to command a—" "Do it, Harper, or I will have to kill him right here, and you might not survive the collateral damage." Swallowing hard, Harper looked down at the massive creature. Okay, big guy. Come on, let's go inside. She took a tentative step backward toward the heavy steel doors leading to the underground pits. To the absolute horror of Lila, who was watching with her jaw clenched so tight her fangs pricked her own lip, Ravage immediately stood up. The beast shook the rein from his massive coat, towering over Harper, and dutifully padded right alongside her, keeping his massive shoulder pressed gently against her side as if shielding her from the rest of the pack. Harper led the deadliest creature in North America back into its cage as if she were walking a golden retriever. Once the heavy steel doors clanged shut, locking the beast away, Blaze grabbed Harper by the upper arm. His grip was tight, burning hot through the thin, soaked fabric of her grey servant's uniform. "You are no longer a servant," Blaze declared, his voice carrying over the murmuring crowd. "Gideon, move her to the east wing. Put her in the gilded suite. No one is to touch her. No one speaks to her unless I authorize it." "Blaze, you cannot be serious," Lila shouted, pushing her way to the front of the crowd, her designer dress ruined by the mud. "She is a human debtor, the daughter of a degenerate gambler. You are putting a maid in the royal wing because of a glitch in your beast's temper?" Blaze turned his head, his eyes flashing a dangerous, blinding gold. "I am the king, Lila. My word is absolute law. If anyone questions my decision, they can take it up with my blade." Lila recoiled, but the hateful glare she shot Harper promised sheer, unadulterated retribution. That night, Harper was escorted not to a damp basement, but to a massive suite with vaulted ceilings, a roaring fireplace, and a mahogany bed that cost more than her father's entire life of debt. A private pack physician, Dr. William Constance, a renowned genetic specialist who consulted for elite private clients in the human world like the Pierce and Constance legal group, was brought in to draw her blood. "Just a precaution," Dr. Constance murmured, adjusting his wire-rimmed glasses as he filled a vial. "The king wants to know why a creature of pure predatory instinct recognized you as a superior." "I'm nobody," Harper insisted, staring at the fire. "My dad was Arthur Bennett. He was a mechanic and a drunk. There's nothing special about me." Dr. Constance didn't answer, but as he held the vial up to the light, Harper swore she saw the dark red liquid shimmer with a faint, almost imperceptible silvery glow. For 3 days, Harper lived in a gilded cage. She was fed gourmet meals and provided with clothes made of the finest silk, yet she was not allowed to leave the East Wing. Blaze visited her every evening. The dynamic between them was shifting rapidly from captive and captor to something far more dangerous. He would sit in the leather armchair across from her, studying her with an intense, burning curiosity that made Harper's skin flush. He asked her endless questions about her childhood, her mother who died when she was a baby, and her life in Oakhaven. He seemed desperate to solve the puzzle of her existence. "Ravage hasn't eaten since you locked him away," Blaze noted on the third night, swirling a glass of amber bourbon. "He just paces the cell, waiting for you." "Let me see him," Harper said softly. "He's just lonely. I think he's been in the dark too long." Blaze's eyes darkened. "He is a monster, Harper. He has killed dozens." "So have you," Harper shot back, immediately clamping a hand over her mouth. She expected him to explode in anger. Instead, a low, genuinely amused chuckle rumbled in Blaze's chest. "You have teeth, little bird. I like that." He stood up, closing the distance between them until he was standing over her. He reached out, his thumb gently tracing the line of her jaw. The sheer heat of his touch sent a jolt of electricity straight to her core. "Tomorrow night is the Continental Alpha Summit. The leaders of the 5 ruling packs will be here. You will attend as my personal guest." "I can't," Harper panicked. "I don't belong in a room full of werewolf royalty." "You belong wherever I put you," Blaze stated softly, an undeniable possessiveness lacing his words. The next evening, the estate was transformed. Massive crystal chandeliers bathed the grand ballroom in golden light. The air was thick with the scent of expensive perfume, roasted meats, and the heavy territorial pheromones of visiting Alpha Kings. Harper was dressed in a stunning, floor-length, midnight blue gown that Blaze had specifically ordered for her. It clung to her curves and made her look nothing like the girl who scrubbed diners for $9 an hour. But Lila had not forgotten the humiliation in the courtyard. As Harper stood near the grand staircase, nervously clutching a glass of champagne, Lila approached with a group of high society female wolves from the visiting packs. "Look at this," Lila sneered loudly, ensuring the music didn't drown out her voice. Several alphas turned to watch the spectacle. Blaze's little stray dog playing dress-up. "Tell me, Harper, did you steal this dress, or did you scrub enough toilets to pay for the hemline?" The visiting women laughed, a cruel, harmonious sound. "Arthur Bennett's bastard daughter," Lila continued, her eyes gleaming with malice. $50,000 in debt, living on our charity. You might be wearing silk, human, but you still smell like cheap bleach and desperation. You are nothing but a beggar." Harper's face burned. She wanted the marble floor to open up and swallow her. She looked around, but Blaze was caught in a deep conversation with an aggressive-looking Russian alpha across the room. "I may be poor," Harper said, forcing her chin up, "but at least I don't have to tear others down to feel important." Lila's face twisted in fury. She raised her hand, ready to slap the human across the face and remind her of the physical hierarchy. Before her hand could connect, the massive double doors of the grand ballroom burst open. The heavy oak doors slammed against the stone walls with the force of a bomb going off. The music screeched to a halt. Every alpha in the room flashed their fangs, dropping into defensive stances. Standing in the doorway was not a rival pack, but a convoy of humans. 6 men in pristine, tailored black suits spread out, their hands resting on the grips of concealed weapons. They moved with military precision. Through the center of the formation walked a tall, distinguished older man carrying a leather briefcase. He reeked of authority and old money. It was Richard Pierce, the senior partner of the Constance and Pierce Legal Group, a firm that even the werewolf elite feared because they controlled the global banking infrastructure that kept the packs hidden. Blaze stepped forward, his eyes narrowed. "Richard, you are trespassing on sovereign territory during a closed summit." "My apologies, King Blaze," Richard Pierce said smoothly, his voice carrying effortlessly through the dead silent ballroom. "But my firm has been searching for a specific individual for 21 years. We tracked a recent blood sample submitted to one of our subsidiary labs by a Dr. William Constance." Lila scoffed. "If you're looking for a debtor, Pierce, we just acquired the Bennett girl. She owes 50 grand. You can have the trash when we're done with her." Richard Pierce didn't even look at Lila. He walked straight past 3 growling alphas, zeroing in on Harper, who was frozen by the staircase. When the imposing lawyer reached her, he did something that made Blaze Montgomery's heart stop cold. Richard Pierce bowed deeply at the waist. "Miss Harper," Pierce said, his voice echoing in the silent room, "I am overjoyed to finally find you. The name Arthur Bennett was a forgery. He was a low-level smuggler who kidnapped you from your crib 21 years ago to hide you from your enemies." "Kidnapped me?" Harper gasped, the champagne glass slipping from her fingers and shattering on the marble. "What are you talking about?" Pierce opened his leather briefcase, pulling out a heavy, gold-leafed document sealed with a crimson crest, a crest depicting a howling white wolf wearing a crown. "I am the executor of the Sinclair estate," Pierce announced loudly, ensuring every single prejudiced, mocking wolf in the room heard him perfectly. "You are not Harper Bennett. You are Harper Aurelia Sinclair, the sole surviving heir to the Northern Crest dynasty and the legal owner of a $70 billion trust fund." The blood drained from Lila's face. The visiting alphas staggered backward in shock. "But more importantly," Pierce continued, his eyes meeting Blaze's stunned gaze, "you are the last true-born White Wolf royal. You don't owe the Obsidian Crest $50,000, Your Highness. By the ancient laws of the land, you own them." The grand ballroom of the Obsidian Crest estate, which just seconds ago had been a boiling cauldron of territorial aggression, intoxicating perfumes, and suffocating aristocratic pride, was now a tomb of frozen silence. The heavy, relentless rain lashing against the floor-to-ceiling stained glass windows was the only sound that dared to interrupt the profound shock gripping the room. $70 billion. A white wolf royal. The words hung in the air like a guillotine blade suspended by a thread. The visiting Alpha Kings, men who ruled vast, bloody territories across the continent with iron fists and terrifying cruelty, suddenly looked incredibly small. These were warlords who commanded armies of lethal predators, yet they instinctively took a synchronized step back, their expensive leather shoes scraping nervously against the polished marble. Their inner beasts, creatures driven purely by dominance and hierarchy, recognized the ancient apex predator bloodline that the human lawyer had just named. The White Wolves were not just a legend. They were the original monarchs of the lycanthrope world, a dynasty thought to have been completely eradicated in a coordinated, brutal assassination plot 2 decades ago. "This is a parlor trick," Lila hissed, her voice shattering the heavy silence like a dropped crystal champagne flute. Her face, usually a mask of haughty, engineered perfection, was contorted into a grotesque portrait of jealousy and manic denial. She pointed a trembling, manicured finger at Harper, her chest heaving as she struggled to breathe through her rage. "Look at her! She is a diner waitress! She spent the last 3 weeks scrubbing the mud off my boots with a toothbrush. She is Arthur Bennett's trash! This is a corporate scam!" Richard Pierce, the impeccably dressed senior partner of the Constance and Pierce legal group, turned his cold, calculating gaze towards the frantic female wolf. The human lawyer did not flinch at the sight of her glowing, dangerous yellow eyes. He possessed the quiet, terrifying confidence of a man who controlled the global economy. Arthur Bennett was a ghost, and a remarkably pathetic one at that, Pierce stated, his tone carrying the precise, clipped cadence of a corporate boardroom. He opened a thick manila folder from his leather briefcase, the sharp rustle of the heavy parchment echoing ominously. He was a low-level smuggler operating out of the Canadian borderlands. When the orchestrated hit on the Sinclair Royal House occurred 21 years ago, the assassins hired human couriers to dispose of the remains. To ensure the story is completely reliable, I will give you the name of the man who organized the ground team. Thomas Arrington, a notorious private military contractor. Arrington paid Bennett a devastating sum to throw the royal infant into the freezing waters of the Atlantic. Pierce adjusted his wire-rimmed glasses, looking down at the paperwork before shifting his gaze to King Blaise Montgomery. But Arthur Bennett was a degenerate gambler with a sharp eye for leverage, Pierce continued, his voice echoing flawlessly across the vaulted ceilings. He recognized the royal birthmark on the infant's shoulder, the ancient crest of the crescent and the star. He knew her bloodline was priceless. He kept her alive as an insurance policy, hiding in plain sight in the miserable, forgotten logging town of Oakhaven, hoping to one day ransom her back to the surviving loyalists of the crown. Harper stood frozen by the grand staircase, her mind reeling, struggling to bridge the impossible gap between the life of poverty she had known and the earth-shattering reality unfolding before her. Just yesterday, her biggest concern had been whether her next paycheck would cover the electricity bill. Now, she was standing in a bespoke midnight blue gown, listening to a man explain how she was the heir to a lost empire. Unfortunately for Arthur, his gambling addiction far outweighed his strategic patience, Pierce said smoothly, a hint of dark irony coloring his professional tone. He racked up catastrophic debts with the very predators he was hiding her from. The irony is staggering, King Blaise. Arthur sold the wealthiest woman on the planet into indentured servitude for $50,000. He sold you your own queen. Pierce reached into the inner pocket of his tailored jacket and produced a sleek, heavy black card forged from solid titanium. He placed it deliberately onto a nearby silver tray. The dull clink of the metal sounded like a gavel falling in a courtroom. The Sinclair Global Bank underwrote the massive territorial expansion loans for the Obsidian Crest Pack 10 years ago, Pierce declared, turning his attention fully to Blaze, whose storm-grey eyes were wide, with a mixture of horror and absolute awe. Due to a technical default on the secondary land clauses regarding sovereign immunity, the deed to this mountain, this fortified estate, and every single asset within a 100-mile radius belongs exclusively to the Sinclair Trust, which means, King Blaze, Miss Harper literally owns the floor you are standing on. You do not hold her debt. She holds your entire existence. Blaze Montgomery, the undefeated, ruthless Alpha King of the Obsidian Crest, stared at the woman he had abducted from a greasy spoon diner. The scattered puzzle pieces of the last 3 weeks slammed into place with terrifying, blinding clarity. It explained the way she had survived the suffocating pressure of his alpha aura without collapsing. It explained the way his own inner beast, deeply buried in his subconscious and violently aggressive to all outsiders, had felt strangely possessive and protective of her from the moment she crossed the estate's threshold. "Liar!" Lila shrieked at the top of her lungs. The sheer humiliation of being drastically outranked by the impoverished girl she had relentlessly tormented finally snapped the last thread of Lila's sanity. Her bones cracked fiercely, a sickening symphony of snapping cartilage and tearing muscle as she began to shift into a massive wolf form right in the middle of the crowded ballroom, her expensive silk dress shredded into ribbons, falling to the floor as thick, tawny fur erupted from her skin. "I will rip her throat out and prove she bleeds like a peasant," Lila roared, her jaws elongating into a terrifying muzzle dripping with saliva. "Lila, stand down!" Blaze bellowed, his voice laced with the heavy, dominating command of an alpha. He reached frantically over his shoulder for the silver broadsword strapped to his back, fully prepared to decapitate a member of his own High Council to protect the girl. But Blaze did not need to draw his blade. As the massive, heavily muscled female wolf dug her claws into the marble and lunged through the air toward Harper, a dormant instinct buried deep within Harper's ancient DNA violently awoke. The overwhelming stress of the night, the shocking revelation of her stolen past, and the immediate, lethal threat to her life completely shattered the mental dam that had kept her true nature suppressed for 21 years. Harper did not cower. She did not scream. She did not wait for the king to save her. She simply raised her delicate, pale hand. A kinetic shockwave of pure, blindingly cold energy exploded from her center. The temperature in the massive ballroom plummeted below freezing in a fraction of a millisecond. Thick, glittering frost instantly spider-webbed across the polished marble floors, crawling rapidly up the massive stone pillars and freezing the condensation on the crystal chandeliers above. The sheer, crushing atmospheric pressure of a white wolf royal's aura slammed into the room. It was not a demand for respect. It was an absolute, biological mandate for submission. It felt as though the gravity in the room had suddenly been multiplied by 1,000. Lila was swatted out of the air as if she had been struck by an invisible, speeding freight train. She crashed violently into a solid stone pillar with a sickening crunch that echoed over the roaring rain outside. She fell heavily to the frosted floor, whimpering in agony, utterly paralyzed by the dominant, suffocating energy radiating from the former diner waitress. But the display of power did not stop with Lila. All around the grand room, the visiting Alpha Kings, proud, vicious warlords who bowed to no one, were simultaneously forced to their knees. The pressure was absolute and undeniable. They gasped for air, their inner beasts completely submitting to the apex predator standing before them. Even Blaze, fighting the pressure with every single ounce of his legendary, unmatched strength, felt his powerful legs tremble uncontrollably before he slowly, respectfully, lowered himself to one knee on the freezing marble. Harper stood perfectly still in the center of the kneeling royalty. The heavy silk of her midnight blue gown billowed slightly from the intense, ambient energy swirling around her. Her eyes, once a soft, unremarkable hazel, were now burning with a brilliant, luminescent silver light that illuminated the dark corners of the grand hall. The fear that had dictated her entire life evaporated, replaced by the cold, unshakable certainty of her bloodline. I spent my entire life apologizing for my own existence. Harper's voice echoed through the room. It was no longer the timid, exhausted whisper of a frightened debtor, but the resonant, commanding tone of a queen who had finally found her throne. She lowered her hand, her glowing silver eyes locking onto Lila, who was currently pressing her bleeding snout desperately into the ice-covered floor in an act of total, pathetic submission. "You took immense pleasure in reminding me of my poverty, Lila," Harper said softly, the words slicing through the silence like a scalpel. "You knocked over my buckets. You mocked my clothes. You told me I was a stray dog living on your charity." Harper took a slow, deliberate step forward, the heels of her shoes clicking sharply against the ice. "You will never speak to me like that again," Harper commanded, the royal aura pressing down harder on the room with every word she spoke. "You do not own me. You do not own this pack. And as of tonight, you do not even own the clothes on your back. This hierarchy is entirely broken, and I am the one who holds the pieces." The grand ballroom of the Obsidian Crest estate, previously a boiling cauldron of territorial aggression and aristocratic pride, was now a tomb of frozen silence. The frost that had spiderwebbed across the marble floors from Harper's explosive release of energy was slowly beginning to melt, pooling into tiny, reflecting puddles around the knees of the most dangerous men in North America. Every alpha in the room remained locked in absolute submission. The sheer, crushing, biological weight of a white wolf royal's aura was not something they could fight. It was woven into their very DNA to bow to the Sinclair bloodline. Standing in the center of the kneeling kings, Harper Sinclair's mind was reeling, struggling to bridge the impossible gap between the life she knew and the reality unfolding before her. Just yesterday, her biggest concern had been whether the transmission in her rusted sedan would hold out long enough for her to make her shift at Pete's Diner. She had spent the last 3 weeks with her hands submerged in boiling bleach water, terrified of missing a spot on the baseboards lest she be punished. Now, according to the immaculate, terrifyingly calm lawyer Richard Pierce, she possessed a $70 billion trust fund. She didn't just owe the Obsidian Crest $50,000. She owned the very stone beneath their feet. "Mr. Pierce," Harper's voice trembled slightly, the residual adrenaline making her hands shake. She looked at the heavy titanium card he had placed on the silver tray. "Are you absolutely certain? Arthur Bennett. He was the only father I ever knew. Even if he was awful, how could he fake a life for 21 years? Richard Pierce straightened his bespoke suit, completely unfazed by the room full of paralyzed werewolves. He opened a manila folder from his leather briefcase, the sharp rustle of the paper echoing like a gunshot. "Arthur Bennett was a ghost, Your Highness," Pierce explained, his tone carrying the precise, clipped cadence of a corporate boardroom. "He was a low-level smuggler operating out of the Canadian borderlands. When the orchestrated hit on the Sinclair royal house occurred 2 decades ago, the assassins hired human couriers to dispose of the remains. Bennett was paid to throw you into the freezing waters of the Atlantic. But Arthur was a degenerate gambler. He recognized the royal birthmark on your shoulder, the crescent and the star. He knew your bloodline was priceless. He kept you alive as an insurance policy, hiding in plain sight in a miserable logging town, hoping to one day ransom you back to the surviving loyalists." Pierce adjusted his glasses, looking down at the kneeling form of King Blaze Montgomery. Unfortunately for Arthur, his gambling addiction far outweighed his patience. He racked up debts with the very predators he was hiding you from. The irony is staggering. He sold the wealthiest woman on the planet into indentured servitude for $50,000. "Lies! It's all corporate manipulation!" Lila shrieked. The spell of silence broke. Lila, who was still pressed against the ice-cold floor from Harper's kinetic blast, struggled to lift her head. Her designer silk dress was shredded, her face bruised, but her vanity and sheer jealousy refused to let her submit. "Blaze, don't let this human suit dictate our laws. She is a diner waitress. You saw her scrubbing my boots. She smells like cheap grease and poverty." Blaze's storm-grey eyes darkened with a lethal, terrifying fury. He pushed against the overwhelming pressure of Harper's aura, forcing himself up from one knee to stand at his full, imposing height. The Alpha King's inner beast was roaring, not to challenge the Queen in front of him, but to slaughter the woman insulting her. "Lila!" Blaze's voice was a low, vibrating growl that rattled the crystal champagne flutes on the tables. "You will shut your mouth, or I will tear out your throat myself." "You don't have to, Blaze," Harper interrupted. The sound of her own voice surprised her. It wasn't the timid, exhausted whisper of Harper the waitress. It was cold, resonant, and dripping with an authority she didn't know she possessed. The white wolf DNA within her was waking up rapidly, flooding her veins with an ancient, undeniable power. She walked slowly toward Lila. The heavy silk of her midnight blue gown whispered against the wet marble. She stopped inches from Lila's face, looking down at the woman who had made her life a living hell for the past 3 weeks. "You took great pleasure in reminding me of my poverty, Lila," Harper said, her voice echoing perfectly in the silent room. "You knocked over my buckets of dirty water. You told me I was nothing but trash, a beggar living on your charity." Harper turned to Richard Pierce. "Mr. Pierce, as the sole heir to the Sinclair Trust, what is the exact status of the Obsidian Crest's financial portfolio?" Pierce flipped a page in his ledger. "The Obsidian Crest utilized a holding company to borrow $400 million from Sinclair Global Banking 10 years ago for territorial expansion. Because you are the sole underwriter, you have the right to call in the debt immediately. Furthermore, as the legal owner of the land, you dictate residency." Harper looked back down at Lila, whose eyes were finally widening with genuine, absolute terror. The reality of the situation was crashing down on her. Physical strength meant nothing in the face of limitless institutional power. "I don't need to fight you, Lila," Harper said softly, though the words cut like silver blades. "I am calling in your personal debts. I am seizing your accounts, your vehicles, and the very clothes in your closet. And as the owner of this mountain, I am evicting you. You have exactly 5 minutes to leave my property. If you are found within 100 miles of Oakhaven or this estate by sunrise, you will be hunted not as a rival wolf, but as a trespasser on Sinclair land. Get out." Lila opened her mouth to argue, to scream, to demand a trial by combat, but she looked around the room. The visiting Alpha Kings, men she had tried to impress all night, turned their faces away in disgust. Gideon, the beta of the pack, stepped forward, his face a mask of stone. "You heard the Queen," Gideon rumbled, grabbing Lila by the arm and hauling her to her feet. "Walk, now!" As Lila was dragged out of the grand doors, sobbing in sheer humiliation, and stripped of everything she had ever valued, the heavy atmosphere in the room began to shift. The visiting Alphas slowly rose to their feet, keeping their eyes respectfully lowered. Harper felt the adrenaline begin to crash. The room spun slightly. The sheer exertion of her royal aura was draining her. She swayed on her feet, the sudden weight of her new reality pressing down on her shoulders. Before she could fall, strong arms caught her. Blaze pulled her flush against his broad chest. He smelled of rain, pine, and an intoxicating, overwhelming protectiveness. He held her securely, his large hand resting against the small of her back. The spark of electricity that jumped between them was no longer just the tension of captor and captive. It was the raging, undeniable fire of the mate bond snapping fully into place. "Gideon," Blaze ordered, never taking his eyes off Harper. "Clear the room. Escort the Alphas to their quarters. Mr. Pierce, we will review the financial transition in the morning." "Of course, King Blaze." Pierce bowed deeply once more. "Good evening, Your Highness." As the massive ballroom emptied, leaving only the king and the newly discovered queen, the silence stretched between them. Blaze gently brushed a stray lock of hair from Harper's face. His touch was incredibly tender, a jarring contrast to the ruthless warlord he had been just days ago. "You terrified them," Blaze whispered, a ghost of a proud smile touching his lips. "You terrified me." "I was terrified," Harper admitted, leaning into his warmth. "Blaze, I don't know how to be a billionaire. I don't know how to be a queen." "You already are one," he replied, his voice dropping to a low, rough rumble. The blood remembers, Harper. The instincts are there. But there is one piece of your legacy that we still need to address. Blaze took her hand, his fingers lacing through hers. Come with me. We need to go to the vaults. The walk down into the subterranean levels of the estate felt entirely different this time. Before, Harper had been a terrified servant marching toward a monster. Now, she walked as the undisputed ruler of the domain. The heavily armored guards lining the stone corridors immediately dropped to one knee and bowed their heads as she passed. The air grew cold and damp as they reached the heavy steel doors of the maximum security pit. Standing outside the doors was Dr. William Constance, clutching a thick, ancient, leather-bound tome. "Your Highness," Dr. Constance said breathlessly, bowing awkwardly, "I ran the cross-references against the ancient texts immediately after processing your blood. It explains everything. The beast. It explains why he bowed." "Tell me," Harper commanded gently. "Ravage is not a mutated dire wolf, as King Blaze believed, Doctor," Constance explained, opening the fragile pages of the book to show a hand-drawn illustration of a massive, black-furred beast standing beside a woman with glowing silver eyes. "He is a royal sentinel. They are a guardian breed, engineered through ancient pack magic, centuries ago, genetically bonded exclusively to the Sinclair bloodline. When your family was assassinated 21 years ago, the Sentinels went mad. They need a royal charge to anchor their minds. Without one, they become feral, unstoppable killing machines." Blaze stared at the steel doors, heavy guilt washing over his sharp features. "I found him chained in a fighting ring in the Deep South 10 years ago. I thought he was just a broken, tortured monster. I brought him here to give him a home, but I couldn't tame him. I had to lock him away to keep the pack safe. I thought I was containing a demon. Instead, I was keeping a fiercely loyal soldier locked away from his true purpose." Harper's heart broke. She stepped forward, placing both hands flat against the freezing steel doors. "Open it," she ordered the guards. They scrambled to turn the heavy hydraulic wheels. The massive doors ground open, revealing the pitch-black, cavernous cell. In the center of the room, anchored to the floor by chains as thick as a man's arm, lay the 9-foot nightmare. Ravage lifted his massive, heavily scarred head, but there was no malice in his glowing amber eyes. The moment he caught Harper's scent, a pathetic, high-pitched whine escaped his terrifying jaws. He dragged his massive body forward, the chains pulling taut against his throat, desperate to reach her. Harper didn't hesitate. She walked straight into the dark cell, the ambient silver light returning to her eyes and illuminating the damp stone. "I'm here," she whispered, her voice cracking as tears blurred her vision. "I'm so sorry it took me so long. I didn't know." Ravage dropped his massive head, pressing his scarred snout into her stomach, letting out a rumbling purr that vibrated the very foundation of the mountain. He had waited 21 years in the dark for his queen, enduring torture, isolation, and madness, all just to feel the touch of his rightful master. Harper reached down, her pale, delicate hands grasping the massive iron collar locked around the beast's neck. She closed her eyes and called upon the freezing, crushing power of her bloodline. A blinding flash of silver energy pulsed from her hands. The centuries-old iron frosted over instantly, turning brittle as glass. With a sharp, ringing crack, the heavy collar shattered into a dozen pieces. The massive chains crashed to the stone floor, echoing like thunder. Ravage was free. The beast stood up to his full, staggering 9-foot height, shaking out his thick black coat. He let out a deafening, triumphant roar that shook the dust from the ceiling, a sound not of rage, but of absolute salvation. He stepped protectively behind Harper, his massive shoulder brushing against her, taking his rightful place at her right hand. Harper turned back towards the doorway, where Blaze stood watching them. The Alpha King of the Obsidian Crest, a man who had brought entire territories to their knees, who commanded armies and hoarded wealth, looked at the diner waitress from Oakhaven with an expression of pure, unbreakable devotion. Blaze stepped into the cell. He didn't look at the beast. He looked only at Harper. Slowly, deliberately, the undefeated Alpha King dropped to one knee on the damp stone floor, bowing his head. "You own the mountain," Blaze said, his voice raw with emotion. "You own the debt. And you own me, Harper. What are your orders, my queen?" Harper Sinclair, the $70 billion heir and the last white wolf royal, rested her hand on the thick fur of her war beast. She looked down at the lethal king kneeling before her, the man who was destined to be her mate. Her life of poverty, of fear, and of scrubbing floors was dead and buried. "My first order," Harper said, a slow, dangerous smile spreading across her lips as she reached out to gently lift Blaze's chin, forcing his storm-grey eyes to meet her glowing silver ones, "is that we are going out into the world. There are people who killed my family. There are people who put these chains on my beast, and starting tomorrow, we are going to hunt them all down." The pack had fallen silent when the beast bowed, but as the queen took her throne, the entire world was about to hear her roar, and that concludes the epic saga of the Alpha King's war beast, bowed to a poor girl. From a desperate waitress scrubbing diner floors to the $70 billion queen of the lycanthropes, Harper Sinclair completely shattered the hierarchy of the Obsidian Crest Pack. Lila got exactly the brutal social retribution she deserved, and the undefeated Alpha King Blaze finally found a mate, powerful enough to bring him to his knees. The revelation of Ravage as a royal sentinel was the ultimate twist that proved true loyalty can never be chained. If you loved this story of hidden identity, secret wealth, and ultimate revenge, you have to hit that like button right now. Share this video with your friends who love intense werewolf romance dramas, and make sure you subscribe to the channel with the notification bell turned on so you never miss our next full-length audio story. Drop a comment below. What was your favorite moment of Harper's revenge? See you next time.